All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming to our talk. Um, we're going to be talking today about the best practices of Spinnaker with primarily a focus on security and governance, but we'll talk about a little bit of everything. This is going to be kind of like, I'm calling it a mid-level talk. So it's not exactly a deep dive, although DB will definitely get into some details. But it's not so high level that you can't, go back home and take some of what we recommend here and implement in your own environment. And well, just one note, it's a kind of a complementary to the talk that was in this room just this past session by our colleague Jason, who did a deep dive on RBAC. So a bit about us. So Kyle Mitchell, technical product manager for Armory. So I manage the Spinnaker enterprise product line we have at Armory. We also have a hosted solution. That's a different product though. I'm based out of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So came here for the balmy weather. It snowed last weekend for me, so that was great. But I've been in IT for about 16 years. Prior to this, I was a technical product manager for another late stage startup doing ghost kitchen delivery. And I got started in sort of as a BA solution architect. Pass quickly to you.
Hey, David Beale. As it says there, solutions engineer. But prior to that, I was a backend developer, SRE, DevOps, all of those things. I've used Spinnaker at scale. I've been the one and only engineer for a pretty big company using Spinnaker, and I've used it in startup environments too. So I have a lot of experience with it at a scrappy, do-it-yourself level, all the way up to having people audit me. And I'm based in Chicago. Super happy to be here in Detroit. Wish I could have swam here. It would have been quicker.
Thanks. So why us? So as Armory is a vendor and partner, so we've have the lucky opportunity of observing, installing, configuring, monitoring all kinds of different Spinnaker environments across a ton of different customer environments, different industries, as you can see up on the screen, from e-commerce, banking, tech. So we've basically seen it all, and we're really here just so you can learn from our experience. So, some of the challenges we've seen, hopefully you can skip and avoid. So before I hand it over to DB, who will take us through the bulk of the presentation on the recommendations, just wanted to context and level set a bit. So as the slide shows, Spinnaker is powerful but complex. So I could get into that old tripe of, great power, great responsibility, Spider-Man thing, but I'll just vaguely reference it. But no, in all seriousness, obviously Spinnaker came from Netflix, came from Google. Fast forward to today, we've got a ton of, household brand names that are running their business. Apple, Home Depot, Salesforce. There's a bit of a myth out there that Spinnaker is sort of on the decline. It was kind of alluded to in the keynotes, but hopefully over the next 2 days and maybe even into KubeCon, that myth gets dispelled. It's really not going away. The key feature that we really want to highlight is lifecycle management. So that's like one of the features that kind of distinguishes Spinnaker from many of the other CD tools out there, and that is that you can, in a single tool, manage a git commit, all the way from a CI push to production across multiple clouds, multiple environments. You don't need multiple tools. You don't need to run things once and hand it off. You can have that in a single pane of glass view. So that's something sort of to keep in mind as these, these do's and don'ts are talked about. And just a quick segue into what DB is going to talk about is Spinnaker is by definition a CD tool. It's not a CI tool with CD kind of bolted on after the fact as an afterthought. It's a dedicated specialized CD tool. So yeah, with that context in mind, pass it over to DB to walk us through.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, I've been on the other side of this a lot, and I like things to be as interactive as possible. So if there's any point where you have a question or what I'm saying doesn't make sense, just, speak and we'll talk. But yeah, everything that Kyle said is totally true. Spinnaker is powerful and flexible, and it's definitely complex. But there's some ways to make it simpler and still secure. But let's get into a few things first. So if you ask 30 people where CI starts or stops and CD starts, I think you'd get at least 35 different answers. People are always conflating the two. They're always like, you know, how can I trigger my Spinnaker to build my Docker images from GitHub, and or how can I make Jenkins deploy artifacts? And you could technically do both of those things, but you probably shouldn't. And I'm driving this home because Spinnaker out of the box is pretty secure. I mean, it's essentially an enterprise Java application with all the trappings of enterprise Java. And especially, when you're using a reseller like ourselves or our friends at OpsMX, you're getting that LTS support, and you're getting CVEs, everything you need. So if you're a big enough organization, you've got the engineering power to dive into Spinnaker, you're probably doing so with pretty good security practices in mind. But where you could really run into some issues is bringing vulnerabilities in from your CI process. A lot of companies, for better or for worse, accidentally have public Docker images on Docker Hub, or they're pulling their Docker images from an unencrypted S3 bucket, or a public GitHub repo, or there's a lot of different places that you can make some small errors before you get to Spinnaker world, and you're bringing those vulnerabilities in. So I think that it's really important to think of it like this. You've got your code change, you're testing your code, you're building it, you're packaging and publishing it. And what does that give you? That gives you an artifact. From that point on, you're in CD. And that's really what Spinnaker does, is it takes an artifact from a secure place and deploys it to a secure place. Now, what an artifact is really up to you. It can be a Docker container, like I talked about. It can be, Terraform code that you apply to your cloud provider or your private cloud from within Spinnaker, but it's an artifact. So you want to make sure that that artifact is created with security in mind. And yeah, getting into that, document your process, tag your images properly, and use artifact storage. There's a million different ways to do this. You can have all of your documentation in your code. You can tag your images pragmatically using git SHAs or MD5 checksums, or whatever you want to do, but having this like defined and locked down is really going to be your biggest value add once you get into the deployment process. And then for storage, there's a million different ways to do that too, but getting into things that are a little bit more specific, obviously, like, secret management is like a pretty talked about and drilled into the ground subject, but you don't put secrets in your code. You don't put it on live production servers unless they're hashed. Don't do that in your CD either. Treat all of your workloads like they're sort of production code or production builds, and make sure that you're not just directly referencing the ALB of your Kubernetes cluster when you're deploying your artifacts to it. Hash it. And then finally, or not finally, but in that sort of stream of thought, webhook or automatic triggers with webhook secrets are, sorry, speaker notes. You definitely want to enforce any of those triggers from a webhook with a secret. We at Armory have a specific policy engine that I think Jason probably touched on a little bit. But, this is all just sort of best practices, and whether you're using Armory tooling or not, it's available. Another big thing is disaster recovery. I think, if you're relying on a tool like Spinnaker to deploy all of your infrastructure, you want to treat it as a core piece of your infrastructure in and of itself. It should be a part of your plan. If you're dealing with like HIPAA or any kind of financial compliance, this is kind of a no-brainer. But for less regulated industries, you still want to treat this like a piece of core infrastructure run in the same way that, you know, anything else in your stack would be. And finally, on this note, this is a little bit more Spinnaker specific, but I'm not going to read the slides, but you kind of get the gist of the process. This is a little bit of a broad and like easy to argue about subject, but you know, Spinnaker's kind of only as good as the outside security enforcement that you have around it. So whether you're using like SAML or you're using, like I said, our policy engine, Okta, any of those integrations, I'm not going to get too heavily into it because I don't want to like regurgitate or re-emphasize what Jason already talked about. But you know, your organizational policies should be inherited into your deployment process is the TLDR. And yeah, like I said before, Spinnaker's pretty safe out of the box. So it's not like it's this crazy like rogue open source application with no like patterns around it or any kind of historical relevance of how it's worked for other companies. You know, you don't really hear about Netflix getting hacked too often. At least I haven't. That was really quick, but this would be a really good time to make it a little more interactive if anybody had any questions or kind of wanted to dig in deeper. Not all at once. What's up?
What would be like a story about something that is like a bad practice that you really remember that with all of these good practices, like all of these do's, but like a particular tone that you remember that caused issues just by not using Spinnaker as intended?
Yeah, you know, I've seen some pretty questionable use of like environment variables. You know, you can set environment variables in Spinnaker. It's a deployment stage, and I've seen people just hard code some things into that they probably shouldn't. And then I've seen some pretty really the thing that I wanted to drive home was the weaknesses of your CI pipeline that you're inheriting. So I've seen a lot of things where it's like, oh yeah, you know, we've just got this .env file with a bunch of environment variables that gets sourced in our Docker build process, and that's in VCS, or it's even, you know, being pulled from like an S3 bucket or something. So I think you know, poor secrets management is probably the thing I've seen the most of. Yeah. How do you manage secrets? Well, I mean, you know, that's pretty subjective, right? You can manage secrets any way you want. But, you know, Spinnaker, I've seen it integrated pretty tightly with Vault. I've also seen people just use like KMS storage or Amazon Secret Manager. It really depends on the platform. I would just say treat it like any other application in your stack. You know, whatever you're using for secrets management and the rest of your application, use that for your deployments as well.
Yeah, the one thing I'll just add about that, I mean, the real message is use a secrets manager, right? Like that's the biggest thing. But for those of you who are past that, the next thing the slide showed was really the point of separation of configuration and secrets, because configuration doesn't need to be as tightly controlled, and is more useful to use, you know, in branching your code out in this way and that. But the secrets themselves absolutely need to be locked down. So we've definitely seen situations where they're conflated, and then it causes issues because either A, the configuration is way too locked down, which limits your ability to run robust pipelines. So just separating those things out is a really good idea.
One more point on that. Using a product like Policy Engine and being able to set individual policies for pipelines really gives you a lot of value, because then, a lot of times your secret management might be a little looser in lower environments. Dev, staging, you're not using production databases. Maybe there are some shared secrets that like developers have on their laptops so that they can integrate with some third-party services or applications or something like that. And so you can keep things a little bit looser in the lower environments and then really be able to lock them down in production. Just gives you more options. Cool. Any other questions?
I'll touch on one other thing. Yeah, please. Let's go back. So this slide, just to highlight the message here, which is that essentially using the same identity provider groups that you have already established in your identity provider, leverage those as much as you can in Spinnaker. Don't try to recreate them, because then you have a synchronization problem where you add somebody to a group and then it's a different group in Spinnaker. So that's kind of the whole point of this message is pushing those, and that's even why it's organized as this push down kind of concept. So push from your IDP into Spinnaker, and then using the Fiat service, you can map those to your cloud providers without actually having the credentials, the cloud provider credentials right in there. And although we've alluded to it, I just want to hammer it home, is if you're from a real governance perspective, and I think this is in particular importance for any kind of regulated company, government entities, etc., you need to have a policy enforcement, because that if you're talking to CIO or your security team, etc., regardless of the tool, in this case it's the CD tool, you have to be able to efficiently enforce the organizational policies and security situations. So, we use nicer language in here, but really, you need a dedicated policy engine. Out of the box, it's tricky to do with just Spinnaker. You can also use your identity provider, but then there's challenges there. So if you either build one yourself, or you can find a vendor that offers that pre-built tool and is something that integrates directly into Spinnaker, that's a really good bet. Okay.
One more thing about Policy Engine 2, and this is just very Armory specific, but we have a tool that leverages Open Policy Agent and really gives you a lot of power in enforcing organizational policies, inheriting them from other identity providers, making them at a pipeline based controls at the application level. So it's very Armory specific, but we'd love to demo it to you. Find me or anyone else in a Not Afraid to Commit shirt, and we'd be happy to open a laptop and show you what we've got going on. One last chance for questions. Anyone? Okay.
Okay.
Cool. We didn't really mention it, but all of our contact information are in the slides. The slides should be on the website or somewhere, but we also have them right there too. Email us, follow us on Twitter. I don't really tweet about Spinnaker that much. Maybe I should.